When the Duke of Rutherford told the assembled tenants of Ashcombe that Miss Eleanor Hale's signature meant nothing on the estate, he did not yet know that within the year no lease, ledger, or letter would leave the house without it. Ashcombe had run on Eleanor Hale's hand for 3 years before anyone with a title thought to question it. Her father had been the estate's land agent for 2 decades, a quiet, careful man who taught his daughter to read a rent roll before she could properly dance, and who took her with him from the age of 8 into every barn, mill, and boundary ditch on the property until she understood the land as thoroughly as he did himself. When a fever took him in her 20th year, no one at Ashcombe saw fit to replace him. Her uncle, old Squire Fenwick, was by then too unsteady in mind to sign his own name reliably, let alone manage 2,000 acres of arable land, 3 tenant farms, a working mill, and a household of 11 servants who had not been paid a day late in all that time. It was Eleanor who kept them so. She rose before the house did, walked the home farm in boots that had belonged to her father, and returned to the estate office to balance figures that would have made a lesser bookkeeper weep with relief, simply to be rid of. The tenants brought their troubles to her because she answered them the same day, and never with a promise she did not keep. The steward's clerk, a nervous young man named Ferris, deferred to her without being told to, and had done since his first week. She signed leases as E. Hale, land agent, because there was no one else living at Ashcombe fit to sign them, and for 3 years the arrangement had suited everyone who mattered, which was to say, everyone who lived and worked upon the land, and no one who did not. She kept, too, a private ledger of her own, one that had nothing to do with rents or wages, in which she recorded each small improvement she made to the estate, as though building a case for herself that she never expected to need to argue. The new drainage on the low meadow, the hedge laid along the Marsden Road, the 2 additional looms she had persuaded her uncle to purchase for the weaving cottages before his mind went entirely. She did not think of it as pride. She thought of it, when she thought of it at all, as proof against a day she hoped would never come, when someone might ask her by what right she did any of it. Squire Fenwick died in the spring, quietly in his sleep, with Eleanor and Mrs. Pruitt at his bedside, and the mill accounts still open on the desk downstairs, where she had left them the night before. The entail did what entails do. It looked past a devoted niece, with ink-stained fingers, and settled the whole of Ashcombe on a second cousin twice removed, whom nobody at the estate had ever met, and whom Eleanor had not known existed until the solicitor's letter arrived naming him. Julian Vane, Duke of Rutherford, came into Ashcombe in June, with 2 men of business, a valet, and an evident conviction that whatever had been happening at the estate in his absence required immediate and thorough correction. He had inherited 3 properties in 18 months through a chain of deaths that still felt to him more like accidents than inheritance. A cousin, then that cousin's brother, then Ashcombe, on top of the rest, and he had learned, in that short, unhappy education, that the fastest way to be made a fool of was to trust what he had not personally verified. He rode the boundary of Ashcombe on his first full day, ledgers under his arm, and found every lease, every wage book, every letter to the corn factor signed in a hand he did not recognize, and a name his own solicitors had never once mentioned to him. He found Mrs. Pruitt first, in the estate office, dusting a room that plainly did not need dusting, and asked her, with the particular courtesy of a man already irritated, who E. Hale might be. Mrs. Pruitt, who had been housekeeper and companion at Ashcombe since before Eleanor was born, and held decided opinions about dukes she did not trouble herself to conceal, told him plainly that E. Hale was the reason his new tenants had not once been late with their rent, and the reason his mill turned a profit in a year when 2 neighbouring mills had not, and the reason he would find, if he cared to look, that every hedge on the estate had been laid within the last 2 years at half the cost his own steward in Yorkshire charged for the same work. The Duke did not think this answered his question. He asked again, more precisely, Whether E. Hale was a man he ought to have been introduced to by now, and Mrs. Pruitt told him, with some satisfaction, that he would meet her directly, as she had gone down to the mill to settle a dispute over a broken sluice gate, and was expected back within the hour. Eleanor returned, muddied to the knee, her sleeves rolled past the elbow, a coil of rope still slung over one shoulder from helping the miller's man haul the gate back onto its hinges, and found a stranger standing at her father's desk, with her ledgers spread open before him, and an expression she had seen before on men who had already decided something about her before she had said a word. He asked without introduction whether she was the person responsible for the confusion in these accounts. She told him, without apology, that there was no confusion in the accounts, only in whoever had described them to him that way, and that if he would care to sit, she would walk him through every figure on the page and stand behind each one. He did not sit. He asked her name. She gave it. He looked at her hands, at the mud drying on her boots, at the rope over her shoulder, and said that he had been given to understand the estate was managed by a Mr. Hale, and that he would be obliged if she would direct him to that gentleman at his earliest convenience. She told him her father had been dead 3 years, and that she was the Hale who had signed every document he now held in his hand. The Duke set the leases down with the particular carefulness of a man controlling his temper, and said that whatever informal arrangement had suited a dying squire's household would not suit his own, and that going forward no document concerning Ashcombe would be considered valid unless it bore his signature and his signature alone, since, and these were his exact words, spoken to a room that included Mrs. Pruitt, the clerk Ferris, and 2 tenant farmers waiting on quarter-day business, her signature meant nothing on this estate. He rode out within the half-hour to inspect the home farm himself, satisfied he had settled the matter cleanly. Eleanor stood very still until the door closed behind him, then sat down at her father's desk and went back to her figures, because the rent was due in 9 days whether the Duke believed in her hand or not, and someone had to see it collected properly. It was Mrs. Pruitt who reported the remark in full to Eleanor that evening, having had it repeated to her twice over by Ferris, who had gone quite pale relaying it, and had apologized for the Duke's manner, as though the fault was somehow his own. Mrs. Pruitt did not soften the words. She had never believed in softening words for Eleanor, who she said had been raised on plain speaking and would not thank anyone for a kindly lie now, however wounding the truth. She told Eleanor exactly what the Duke had said, in front of whom he had said it, and watched her set down her pen very carefully before she spoke again, as though the care of the gesture were the only thing keeping her hand steady. Eleanor said only that a man who had held Ashcombe for 1 day and could not yet name its 4 home tenants was welcome to whatever opinion of her signature he liked. Mrs. Pruitt, pouring the tea, remarked that opinions had a way of changing on this estate, given time and a decent harvest, and Eleanor did not answer her directly, though she did not disagree either, and finished her tea in a silence that Mrs. Pruitt knew better than to interrupt. For the first fortnight, the Duke conducted his business entirely through his own men, riding out each morning with his steward-elect. A competent but unfamiliar Mr. Sedley brought down from his Yorkshire property, and returning each evening to a study he had claimed as his own, where he reviewed the day's findings with the particular grimness of a man discovering that everything he had been warned to distrust was, upon inspection, entirely correct. The hedges were laid well and cheaply, the mill's accounts balanced to the penny across 2 full years of ledgers. The tenant he had been warned was troublesome, an old man named Corbett, on the East Farm, turned out to have a genuine grievance about a collapsed drainage ditch that Eleanor had already scheduled for repair before Michaelmas, with the stone and labour both ordered and half paid for already. Sedley, to his credit, said as much plainly to the Duke on the 9th day that he had rarely inherited a better-kept estate in 20 years of land management, and could find no fault whatsoever in the previous administration beyond the unconventional fact of who had provided it. The Duke did not enjoy being told this, and said so sharply, before catching himself. He rode out the following morning without Sedley, and found Eleanor at the mill again, this time inspecting the new gate mechanism alongside the miller, speaking to the man in the plain, unhurried way she spoke to everyone on the estate, asking questions about the tension of the sluice chain that made it clear she understood the mechanism a good deal better than the Duke understood it himself. He watched from a distance longer than he had intended to before making his presence known, and when he did, he asked her, with rather less hostility than before, though still no particular warmth, how she had come to learn so much of milling. She told him her father had believed a land agent who did not understand every working part of an estate was no agent at all, only a bookkeeper with a title, and that she had followed him everywhere until she understood every gear and gate as well as he did. The Duke asked, almost despite himself, whether her father had intended her to run the estate. One day, Eleanor said her father had intended no such thing, since no reasonable man intended such a thing for a daughter, and that circumstance alone had put the ledgers into her hands, and she had simply refused to let them fall, for want of anyone else willing to carry them. It became, over the following weeks, a habit neither of them named aloud. The Duke rode out most mornings, and more often than not their paths crossed, at the mill, at the home farm, at the drainage works on Corbet's land, once in the weaving cottages where Eleanor was settling a dispute over the price of finished cloth, and each time he found some reason to ask her opinion before deciding a matter, and each time her opinion proved sound where his own instincts had been uncertain. He began bringing his own questions to her rather than to Sedley, on the fair price to demand from the corn factor at Michaelmas, on which tenant could safely be trusted with an advance against a poor season, on whether the old sheepfold on the north boundary was worth repairing or better pulled down and rebuilt in new stone. She answered him plainly, without flattery and without deference, correcting him outright when she thought him wrong, and he found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he had stopped waiting for the moment she would prove herself mistaken, because that moment never seemed to arrive. There were smaller exchanges, too, unrecorded in any ledger. A morning when it rained through their inspection of the low meadow, and she gave him her father's old oilskin without being asked, because he had come out in a coat meant for London and not for Ashcombe's weather, and he wore it the rest of the day without comment, though he returned it cleaned and mended at the elbow the following week. An afternoon when Ferris made an error in the wage book that would have shorted 2 of the dairymaids a full week's pay, and Eleanor caught it before it reached the Duke's desk, correcting it quietly rather than making an example of the boy, which the Duke noticed and did not forget. He began, without quite deciding to, watching for these small kindnesses the way he had once watched for her errors, and finding a good deal more of the former than the latter. The county assembly at Marsden fell in late July, and Eleanor had not intended to attend at all, having neither the wardrobe nor the appetite for it, until Mrs. Pruitt insisted, on the grounds that the whole county had heard by now of the Duke's declaration about her signature, repeated and embellished in every drawing-room between Ashcombe and Marsden, and that Eleanor hiding at home would only confirm to every gossiping matron in the room that she had been properly put in her place. At last, Eleanor went, in a gown that had been her mother's, remade twice over by her own hand, and found the room exactly as unkind as she had feared it would be. Lady Feltham's circle spoke of her within her own hearing as the steward's girl who had been playing at land agent for want of a husband to keep her occupied, and Lady Augusta Feltham herself, a handsome, composed young woman whom half the room seemed already to assume would shortly be styled Duchess of Rutherford. Asked Eleanor with pointed sweetness whether she found it strange to keep company with tradesmen and tenants all week, and gentlefolk only on a Thursday. The Duke arrived late, having ridden directly from Ashcombe still in his riding coat, and found the room already turning the evening into a quiet entertainment at Eleanor's expense, the way a room full of idle people will turn any vulnerability into sport if no one stops them. He crossed the floor to where she stood at the edge of the dancing, and asked her in a voice pitched precisely to be overheard, whether she would do him the honour of confirming a point of estate business he had been turning over since morning, and proceeded to ask her, in front of Lady Augusta and half the assembled county, a genuine question about the drainage on Corbett's land, listening to her answer with exactly the attention he would have given his own solicitor, and thanking her for it afterward with a small formal bow that carried more weight in that room than any dance could have. It was not a declaration. It was not even particularly warm, but it was, unmistakably, a public correction of what he had said in June, delivered in the same public manner as the original insult, and the room understood it as such. And Lady Augusta's circle found rather less to say for the remainder of the evening. They did not speak of the assembly afterward, not directly, but something in the ease between them had shifted in its wake, and it was 2 nights later, when a summer storm kept the Duke from riding back to the house he had taken in Marsden, and Eleanor found him still at Ashcombe's estate office, reviewing the harvest figures by a single guttering candle, that they spoke plainly for the first time of things that had nothing to do with rents or ditches. He told her haltingly that he had not asked to inherit any of his 3 estates, that each had come to him through another man's death he had barely had time to mourn before the solicitors arrived, that he had spent 18 months quietly terrified of being discovered unfit to hold what had been given him, and that his sharpness with her in June had been less about her sex or her birth than about his own fear that if a steward's daughter could run Ashcombe better than he could, then he had no proper right to it at all. Eleanor told him, in turn, of her father's death and the quiet terror of those first months afterward, when she had not known whether Squire Fenwick's household would keep her on or turn her out entirely, and had simply worked as though her place depended on it, because in every practical sense it had. She told him she had never once believed herself entitled to run the estate. She had only refused to watch it fail for want of someone willing to do the unglamorous work of keeping it alive. It was Mrs. Pruitt who told Eleanor, gently and without her usual bluntness, that the county had begun to speak openly of an understanding between the Feltham family and the new Duke, arranged the previous winter by his late cousin and never formally broken off, a match that would join 2 considerable properties and satisfy every expectation his family had ever held for him. Eleanor had not known of it, and the knowing sat in her like a stone for 3 long days, during which she was careful, deliberate, and entirely correct in every dealing with the Duke, offering him nothing beyond what the estate required, and said nothing at all of what she had heard. It was the Duke himself who raised it awkwardly on the 4th day, telling her that his late cousin had indeed spoken of such a match to the Felthams before his death, that nothing had ever been formally settled between the families, and that he had told Lord Feltham directly, the very morning after the assembly, that he did not intend to honour an understanding he had never made himself, and had no wish to inherit along with the rest. Eleanor asked him, quietly, why he was telling her this now. He said, quieter still, that he did not want her to hear it from anyone else in the county, and mistake his silence for consent to a match he had already refused. The obstacle did not dissolve so easily as that, for Lord Feltham was not a man accustomed to refusal, and called upon the Duke twice more that fortnight, to remind him of obligations he considered a matter of honour regardless of what had or had not been formally signed. And there was a difficult evening in which the Duke's own aunt, Lady Vane, arrived unannounced from London to add her voice to the Felthams' cause, speaking to Eleanor with a cold civility that made plain exactly what she thought of a land agent's daughter standing between a duke and a suitable match. Eleanor bore it without flinching, because she had borne worse from tenants disputing a fair rent, but it cost her something to do so, and the Duke, watching his aunt speak to her that way across his own dinner table, understood for the first time the precise weight of what he was asking Eleanor to withstand simply by choosing him, and chose, without further hesitation, to end the matter plainly the following morning by informing his aunt and Lord Feltham both, in writing, that the question was closed. The proposal, when it finally came, was made in the estate office, over the very desk where he had once told her, and half the county besides, that her signature meant nothing on this land. He told her he had spent the summer discovering that he trusted her judgment over his own solicitors, over Sedley's, and very often over his own, and that he could not imagine signing another document at Ashcombe for the rest of his life without wanting her name set beside his upon it. He asked her to marry him plainly, without poetry, in the same unadorned way she had once explained a drainage ditch to him on his first uncertain week at Ashcombe, and she accepted him in kind, without flourish, because flourish had never been either of their language, and had not needed to be. Within the week he had instructed his solicitors to redraft every standing lease and every future deed at Ashcombe to require both their signatures, his and hers, together, a clause his London lawyer found highly unusual and every tenant on the estate found entirely unsurprising, since most of them had never truly stopped considering the arrangements settled from the day her father died. 5 years on, Ashcombe's rent rolls still carried two names at the foot of every page, his and hers, set side by side in the same steady hands that had signed them from the first. And the drainage on Corbett's land had long since been finished and forgotten as anything more remarkable than ordinary good management. The Duke had grown, in that time, into an agent's understanding of his own land that no longer required Eleanor to explain a sluice gate to him twice, though she still did, on principle, and he still listened on the same principle, because neither of them had ever seen much use in changing a habit that served them well. Their eldest daughter had already been seen following her mother across the home farm, in boots 2 sizes too large, asking questions about hedges with the particular seriousness of a child who had been told, quite truthfully, that no one at Ashcombe was too young to understand how the place ran. And their second child, a son with his father's steadiness and his mother's stubbornness in equal measure, had lately taken to correcting Ferris's arithmetic at the age of 6, to the clerk's evident and long-suffering amusement. Mrs. Pruitt, older now and much slower on the stairs than she liked to admit, still kept the estate office dusted whether it needed it or not, and told anyone who asked that she had known, from the very first week, exactly how the Duke's declaration would end, and had said as much at the time to anyone who would listen. Nothing left Ashcombe unsigned by the hand he had once dismissed, and nothing in 5 years had ever once needed correcting for want of it. There had been a moment, in that first difficult month, that Eleanor did not speak of to anyone, not even Mrs. Pruitt. It came on the 3rd day after the Duke's declaration in the estate office, when she had ridden out alone to the corn factor at Marsden to settle the price for the coming harvest, a negotiation her father had always conducted in person, and one she had managed on his behalf, and then alone, for 3 years running without incident. The factor, a shrewd weathered man named Isles, who had dealt fairly with her father, and had come over time to deal just as fairly with her, greeted her that morning with unusual hesitation, and admitted, when pressed, that word had already reached Marsden of the new Duke's opinion regarding her authority, and that he did not know, in light of it, whether an agreement struck with her hand would be honoured come autumn. Eleanor told him plainly that she could not promise what the Duke would or would not honour, only that every agreement she had ever made on Ashcombe's behalf had been kept to the letter, and that Isles knew this better than any man in the county, having dealt with her for 3 harvests running. Isles, after a long moment, said that was true enough, and shook her hand on the price they agreed that day, though he admitted afterward, over a glass of small beer, that he had done so as much on the strength of her father's memory as on her own. And Eleanor had ridden home that evening, turning the distinction over in her mind more than she liked to admit, wondering how many more such agreements would need her father's ghost standing behind her before they were honoured on her own name alone. It was this uncertainty, more than any single insult, that had cut deepest in the weeks that followed the Duke's declaration. Not the words themselves, which she had heard variations of before, from lesser men who thought a woman with a ledger was a woman who had forgotten her place. But the sudden, precarious knowledge that everything she had built at Ashcombe over 3 careful years could be undone by a single stranger's signature, regardless of how sound her work had been. She did not speak of this fear aloud. She simply worked harder, rose earlier, and kept her own private ledger of improvements a little more diligently than before, as though evidence might yet be required, and she meant to have it ready when it was. The proximity that grew between the Duke and Eleanor through July was not built on any single conversation, but on 100 small ones, most of them concerning nothing more romantic than drainage and rent and the fair price of wool. There was a morning at the sheepfold, on the north boundary, when the Duke, attempting to help move a stubborn ewe that had wedged herself against the old stone wall, ended up sitting rather ungracefully in a puddle of mud, to Eleanor's evident and unconcealed amusement. The first time he had heard her laugh outright since his arrival, and he found he minded the mud a good deal less than he minded the silence returning to her face when she remembered herself, and stopped. There was an afternoon in the weaving cottages when a dispute over the price of finished cloth grew heated between 2 of the weavers, and Eleanor settled it not by ruling in favour of either, but by proposing a third arrangement neither had considered, one that left both women satisfied, and the Duke, watching from the doorway, quietly astonished at a diplomacy he had not thought to look for in an estate office. There was an evening, later in the month, when he found her still at her father's desk, long after the house had gone to bed, working by a single candle over the harvest projections, and instead of asking her to retire, as propriety would have suggested, he sat down across from her and worked through the figures alongside her until the candle guttered out, neither of them speaking of anything beyond wheat prices and rainfall, though something had passed between them, all the same that neither cared to name. The morning after the assembly at Marsden, Mrs. Pruitt found Eleanor at breakfast unusually quiet, turning her teacup in slow circles without drinking from it, and asked her outright what troubled her, since the evening had gone better, by any reasonable measure, than either of them had dared hope. Eleanor admitted, reluctantly, that she did not know what to make of a man who could stand before the whole county and correct, in public, exactly what he had said in public before, and yet say nothing to her privately that suggested his opinion of her had truly changed at all. Beyond the estate business he continued to bring her. Mrs. Pruitt, who had watched a great many courtships unfold at Ashcombe over the decades, though never quite one like this, told Eleanor that men of the Duke's sort rarely announced a change of heart before they had fully finished arguing themselves into it, and that she would do well to be patient a little longer and watch what he did rather than wait for what he might say, since his hands, in her long experience of watching gentlemen, generally told the truth before their mouths caught up to it. The confrontation with Lord Feltham, when it came, was sharper than the Duke had anticipated. Feltham arrived at Ashcombe unannounced on a wet afternoon in August, refused all offers of tea, and stood in the Duke's own study insisting that a gentleman's understanding, even an unwritten one, carried weight regardless of what solicitors had or had not put to paper, and that the whole county would think considerably less of a Duke of Rutherford who set aside a suitable match for the sake of a land agent's daughter with mud on her boots. The Duke, who had spent 18 months learning to hold his temper in rooms full of men who assumed his inexperience, made him foolish, told Feltham with icy precision that he had made no promise to any Feltham, living or dead, that his cousin's private conversations were not binding upon him, and that he would thank Lord Feltham not to speak of Miss Hale in his own house in terms he would not use to her face. Feltham left within the quarter hour, considerably less certain of his position than he had arrived, and the Duke, alone afterward in his study, found that his hands were shaking slightly with an anger he had not fully realized he was carrying on Eleanor's behalf until the moment it had somewhere to go. He told her of the confrontation himself that evening, not wishing her to hear a distorted version of it from the servants' hall, and watched her expression carefully as he described it, uncertain what she would make of a duke defending her honour to a man of Feltham's standing. She was quiet for a long moment before she said simply that she had spent 3 years being spoken of in exactly the terms Feltham had used, by men who considered themselves quite reasonable for using them, and that she had never once had anyone stand in a room and tell them otherwise on her behalf, and that she did not entirely know what to do with the feeling it left in her. The Duke said he had not done it for thanks. She said she had not offered any, only an explanation, and the two of them sat with that admission between them for a long while, saying nothing further, until it was Eleanor who finally broke the silence to ask plainly what he intended to do now that the matter with Feltham was closed. It was, though neither of them named it as such that evening, the question that led directly to everything that followed. The wedding itself was a modest affair by the standards of a dukedom, held at the small parish church nearest Ashcombe rather than in London, at Eleanor's quiet insistence and the Duke's ready agreement, since he had come, by then, to value very little about the county's opinion beyond what the tenants and the land itself required of him. Mrs. Pruitt cried through the whole of the short service and denied it fiercely afterward. Ferrers, promoted by then to full steward's clerk, under Eleanor's continuing supervision, presented the newly married couple with a small leather-bound ledger of his own making, its first page already ruled and headed for their joint signatures, a gift the Duke kept on his desk for the rest of his life. Old Corbett, whose drainage ditch had started it all in its quiet way, told anyone who would listen at the wedding breakfast that he had known Ashcombe would come right in the end, since land that was properly drained generally sorted its other troubles out in time as well. A piece of wisdom he considered equally applicable to marriages and meadows, and repeated often enough that it eventually passed into a kind of local saying among the tenants. In the years that followed, Ashcombe prospered in ways that satisfied even the most exacting of the Duke's London relations, though few of them ever fully understood how, having never once set foot in the estate office to watch how the work was actually done. The Duke took to introducing his wife at every opportunity as the finest land agent in the county before he introduced her as his Duchess, an ordering of titles that scandalized his aunt anew each time she heard it, and delighted Eleanor rather more than she ever admitted aloud. When their daughter was old enough to ask, as she inevitably did, why her mother's name appeared on so many papers alongside her father's, Eleanor told her, in the same plain way her own father had once explained a rent roll to her, that a signature was worth exactly as much as the work behind it, no more and no less, and that the surest way to make certain hers was never doubted again was simply to keep doing the work until doubting it became absurd. It was, by every measure that mattered, at Ashcombe, precisely what had happened. There was one further scene that Mrs. Pruitt liked to tell, in later years, more often than any other, though Eleanor always insisted she embellished it in the retelling. It concerned the harvest supper held at Ashcombe that 1st September, an occasion the Duke had never before troubled himself to attend at any of his other properties, considering it a matter properly left to a steward's discretion. He attended at Ashcombe not because Eleanor asked him to, but because he had by then spent enough weeks watching her manage the estate's people as carefully as she managed its land, to understand that the supper mattered to every family who worked the ground, and that his absence from it would be noticed and remembered long after any ledger entry was forgotten. He arrived in a plain coat rather than his London dress, sat at the long table among the tenants rather than at any separate place set apart for him, and when old Corbett rose, well into his cups, to propose a toast to the health of Miss Hale, the finest agent Ashcombe had ever had or was ever likely to have again, the Duke rose with the rest of the table and drank to it without hesitation, a gesture the tenants spoke of for weeks afterward as proof, more than any assembly correction could have offered, of exactly where matters stood. Eleanor herself, watching him rise with the others, felt something settle in her chest that she did not have a ready word for at the time, though she recognized it later as the beginning of trust rather than its conclusion, a small foundation stone laid rather than a finished wall. She had spent 3 years building Ashcombe's trust in her one careful decision at a time, and she found she wanted the same slow, deliberate certainty with this man, rather than any sudden, sweeping conviction that might prove as insubstantial as it was quick to arrive. It was this, more than the assembly, more than the stormlit evening in the estate office, more even than the proposal itself, that she later named as the true turning point. When asked, though she rarely was asked, since she was not a woman given to recounting her own courtship for the entertainment of others, the Duke, for his part, remembered the harvest supper rather differently, though he arrived at much the same conclusion by a different road. He had spent that whole first summer measuring Eleanor against every assumption he had carried into Ashcombe in June, and finding, again and again, that the assumptions were the ones found wanting rather than the woman. Watching her move down the long table that evening, refilling cups, settling a dispute between 2 farmhands over a wager with the same unhurried competence she brought to a broken sluice gate, laughing at something old Corbett's wife had said, in a way she rarely allowed herself to laugh before him directly. He understood with sudden and total clarity that he had spent 2 months falling into a regard for her that had very little to do with her usefulness to the estate, and a great deal to do with the particular, unhurried way she carried herself through a world that had given her every reason to grow hard and had somehow left her instead simply steady. He did not say any of this to her that evening. He was not, by nature, a man who found such things easy to say, but he found himself watching her rather more than the harvest supper strictly required, and Mrs. Pruitt, who missed very little that happened under Ashcombe's roof, noticed exactly where his attention rested, and said nothing at all, only smiled into her own cup and let the evening carry on as it would.